In this video I will continue to talk about my vision of clean Angular architecture. We will look at data transfer objects, which I use to describe request-response payload, and how they are related with models discussed in previous video. When an Angular application makes a request to fetch data from the API, the backend typically returns a JSON object as a payload. For each API endpoint, we can have different JSON response structures with optional properties and nested objects. Typically, this can be a huge pile of JSON object types that the application frontend can retrieve. I am a big believer in clearly describing what we get and send for each request, so I use data transfer objects or DTOs, which give me a complete view of what is coming from the API so that I can deal with it easily. To create DTO types in the frontend, we need to have an API description if the backend is developed by a different team. But even if the backend and frontend are developed by the same team or even one person, it is still useful to reflect what we expect from the API. DTO also helps describe what we send to the API to meet the server's expectations. We usually need it when we create new entities or update existing ones. So typically we can have two types for each API endpoint, request DTO and response DTO. This is my auth service, and here is the public method login. The login method makes an API call with a login request DTO object as a payload and receives a login response DTO in response. At the top of the service class file, you can find all the DTO types that the service uses. Request and response DTOs often contain nested objects that reflect model types that represent the underlying business data objects. I talked about the models in the previous video, check it out if you haven't already. For example, login response DTO contains a user DTO object that logically represents the user model, while request and response DTOs are tightly associated with the specific API endpoints. Model DTOs represent model types globally in the context of the client-server communication. For example, I use the user DTO type to describe responses from login and sign-up endpoints. Here are my models and DTOs folders. To convert the model to DTO and vice versa, I use mapper classes. In many cases, there won't be much difference between DTO and model. For example, in the task mapper, we see that the DTO object structure and property naming are identical to the task model. For the tag mapper case, the model in the frontend and the DTO are not identical. We need to convert a is-category DTO boolean property to an enum tag type and vice versa. The change mapper class is more complex because change DTO can contain different types of changeable objects that need to be converted into corresponding models using the appropriate mapper classes. We use the model DTO to communicate with the backend API as part of the request-response DTO. Mapper classes convert a DTO of models to frontend type models. These models describe the core entities of the application and are used throughout all frontend code. But we see that in many cases the models are very similar to their DTO representations. Therefore, there is a very strong temptation to simplify the entire flow and exclude mappers and models from the diagram, and just use DTOs everywhere instead of models. The first reason not to do this is that not everything we receive can be directly used in the frontend as it is. The second reason is that we need to follow the loose coupling software design principle. Our eternal frontend implementation does not depend on API description. Let's imagine that the backend team decided to change one important parameter in the DTO. In the case of mappers, we just need to fix it in one place. Otherwise, we will have to change the code in many places, and this may cause errors and problems because we have violated the loose coupling principle. Let me know what you think about mappers' usefulness in the comments. You can find all the code discussed in my public repository on GitHub. I have also attached a link to separate PR with my comments related to this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.